On January 20th, 2022, I joined the railroad team as a contractor. On August 1st, I officially quit after seeing the development team severely mishandle what should have been a simple, cut-and-dry complaint involving a quality of life feature. In all honesty, it was a bit of a petty hill for me to fight till the end on. However, they seriously mishandled the situation, and in the month or so since my leave, I've come to realize that this was more the straw that broke the camel's back than what actual problems I had with the team and the game. Today, I'd like to shine a light on those issues, from the initial petty argument to the greater problems about the game that I think need to be addressed. Because if things keep going the way they're going, I don't think the game is going to last. In the alpha testing stages of Update 7, the colored stations feature was being improved. 6 colors just weren't enough, and so a per station color picker was added. You want unique colors? You can set them all yourself. Soon after the feature was added, one of the developers asked the community whether people would prefer just 8 default selections that you could change in the settings, or if they should include 8 default selections alongside the color picker. At first, people said they'd rather have more important things be added, but I brought up the point that the color wheel was already in the game. The developer said that they maybe wanted something simpler on the UI, but I mentioned that it wouldn't really be that much more complex to players and that people did really want it. Some folks chimed in that they agreed that full color selection alongside the 8 default options would be the best choice of the two. There were 2 reasons people wanted this. One, colorblind accessibility, as the current colors weren't all that great for some folks. The 6 default colors just weren't enough, and these 8 default colors only kind of fixed that. It definitely helped, but there was still some room for confusion. 2, in larger maps, especially on Endless, 6 colors wasn't anywhere near enough to have a unique color for every station. Neither is 8, of course. It still is an improvement over the 6 unchanging options from before, but without the ability to always have a way to differentiate 2 stations from one another, it's only a mildly helpful change. With trains being able to go to so many stations, having 2 that are the same color can really throw a lot of players off. This, plus the fact that they'd proven the full per station picker was possible, made it all the more surprising when a few days later they completely removed and replaced it with the dumbed down 8 default colors. They didn't even have the option to change the colors in the accessibility settings. This was a really weird decision. This is where the petty argument began. This wasn't the most important feature to get into the game, but it was one that was 100% doable, and they had removed it for seemingly no reason, with feedback from the community that it shouldn't be removed. So, of course, I started asking a simple question: why? For the next section, I've decided to censor most names for privacy's sake. However, my own name is not censored, and another former moderator, whose name I would butcher if I tried to pronounce, is also uncensored with permission directly from this user. July 22nd. I bring up the issue. I'm ignored. July 23rd. I ask again, citing a Steam thread where people agreed that the full color picker would be much better. I'm told it'll be in the next version and it's just waiting on being merged. I complain about the lack of communication on this feature, considering yesterday. July 24th. The current version, where you can change the default colors in the accessibility menu, is merged. July 25th. I press the devs again, asking where the per station picker is. The developers simply respond with, "It's implemented in the options." I point out this is a half-assed solution to what the community wanted, and they respond with, "This is how we wanted to do it. Internally, we needed it to be this way." Okay, but didn't you get feedback from community members that they prefer it to be the other way? Are you just gonna ignore that feedback? You specifically asked for it. I know that's different from implementation in the code, but if it needs to be that way in the code, why ask for feedback at all when you can't use it? And also, you had it implemented previously. It doesn't need to be that way. Alright, next oh wait, this is when I escalated things. Oh boy. July 26th. It had been 5 days and I had been only given 2 points for why they did this. 1, we wanted to do it this way, / we wanted a simpler UI. 2, it needed to be this way internally, both of which really weren't strong points. Since they didn't really seem to be listening, I decided to go on strike. No workshop highlights, no weekly contest for me, no helping people in the Discord, no level updates, until this was fixed. The dev who had been explaining this to me went to direct messages and tried to talk me out of it, at which point I just cut them off. Typically, they would take these types of arguments to DMs to try and keep it out of the public eye. This wasn't the first time something like this happened. For curved signals, something nearly identical went down, and their solution in the end just wasn't as good as it could have been, despite my complaints. Also, just trust me on this. To me, that's effectively saying trust my judgment at face value and question nothing. Is that a healthy way to build a game like this? July 28th and 29th. The discussion is continued by other users. A modder is pinged to ask how easy it would be to implement this in the game. The modder attests that the implementation would be very easy. I have an additional quote here from another modder who hasn't made any publicly available mods, but has still messed with the game's code a ton. Can't save hex into int? Surprise, surprise, you actually can. Hex is just 3 numbers 0 to 255, and you can easily convert it to a number which also allows you to get the color back. It fits nicely into the int limit, as hex is only 2 to the power of 8 times 3, or 2 to the power of 24. They would still have 8 bits remaining to use, which could easily be used to have 1 bit for distinction between the color index and values, and 7 bits to choose from 128 color indexes. You have to be a dev? Well, I do code, and I call bullshit on this. Another developer from the team comes forth with a new point. Maybe there's a reason that cartography uses less colors? He's not wrong, there is a reason. There's no need for more than a set amount of colors when you're only worrying about distinguishable borders between adjacent locations, making sure 2 places that are directly adjacent don't share a color. That's the thing. In Railroute, stations aren't directly adjacent, and they don't really have borders, and trains don't always go to the next stations on the line. Sometimes they skip tons of stations, like with inner cities. It's not equivalent to cartography. July 30th. The developers leave long messages mentioning their ideas for themes that can be shared on the workshop eventually. They also mention that these themes probably won't be implemented for a long time. Like, if they're not going to be implemented for a while, why worry about them so much right now? Work on them later. And, like, how would this interfere with themes anyways? If the player wants to play with themes, they can, and if they want custom hex colors, they can do that too. It's not a problem. What about people who change their default colors anyways? They're not going to be using themes anyways, and probably don't want to, right? Some people accept this explanation as a good reason. Some don't. I'm in the latter category, of course, and I kept pressing. One dev absolutely lost his mind over it. The final point this argument boiled down to was, you don't understand the code. Yet, previously, 2 modders said it was possible. The one who made that prior comment had this to say. You don't know the code. This is probably the most legitimate argument out of all this bullshit. I understand that they don't want to show the code to the public, or even just to one DM, but still, how fucked is your code that you can't make a small adjustment like this? And if the code is really that fucked, maybe it's time to focus on improving the code quality rather than pumping out new stuff that builds on top of that already fucked up code? While you don't know the code is a legitimate argument, it's something similar to just trust me on this. A dismissal without a real explanation backing it. It had been over a week by the time this point was finally presented, and despite it being their best point, it still really wasn't that strong of one. We have other plans, and it's on our roadmap/backlog, but low priority because of other stuff. These were both mentioned, but in the middle of other arguments, which makes me feel like they were just trying whatever they could to stop said argument. It's understandable that they didn't want it happening, but the devs didn't really handle it well, in my opinion. By now, after getting absolutely nowhere, I threw in the towel for good. I didn't want to deal with them any further. They couldn't provide good arguments in favor of their decision, while there was a mountain of reasons against it. But as I've said before, this was more the last straw than anything. I've got much bigger concerns about where the game's headed than just this silly argument. This was just the start. Since I joined the team in January, I feel the game's been taken in a different direction than before. And, not just behind the scenes. For example, let's take a look at the game's updates. Updates 1 and 2 added in some pretty cool things. Broken sensor warnings, arrival sensor any platform selection, keybind selection, in-game workshop voting, routing sensors on auto blocks, and a ton of editor improvements. None of these on their own were really that game-changing, but that's fine, they didn't need to be. The features improved upon the existing game, amplifying the current experience and making things generally better for every leg of the community. Together, these added up for an amazing set of updates. There was even one game-changing feature, urban transit contracts, which allowed for a wild new way to add trains to your endless network that expanded upon the concept of the coach yard in a clever way. The best of both worlds, a flashy, completely new feature which both changes things up and still improves upon what's already there. Update 3, meanwhile, added the inventory. If you haven't seen my video talking about how that was a failure, you can go watch that for a more detailed explanation. Too long, didn't read, it was a whole new feature that completely changed the way Timetable could be played. It was hyped up in the months leading up to its release, then promptly not used by anyone because it wasn't actually that fun to play with and was too hard to build around in the editor. It completely flopped and would have been forgotten immediately if it weren't for a creator contest I hosted. Update 4 tried to fix 3 by adding in Rush Hour, a whole new game mode built around the inventory. It was a good idea to help fix the troubles it had, but in the end, it was rushed, pun intended. The maps included in the update sucked, using a method to spawn trains that was more frustrating than fun. There were only 2 maps total packaged with the update. This was received a bit better, but still kinda flopped. Update 5 tried to fix 4 by introducing leaderboards, new maps with better spawning methods, and fixing many issues with the current version of Rush Hour. Once again, it was hyped up. A lot of people at this point weren't interested, though, as the new features had proven problematic in the last 2 updates, and folks didn't really care about it anymore. There were also a few problems with, say, the leaderboards making people be unrealistically competitive due to insane strats the top players came up with, which turned away some folks, as the times weren't possible for many to even come close to achieving. Overall, this was far more of a success, but it took 2 prior failures for the developers to straighten things out and get it mostly right. Why didn't they aim to get it right the first time around? Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think new, crazy ideas are bad. However, when you focus so much of your time and effort solely on a new part of a game, release features which are at roughly half their potential or worse, and do this for 3 updates in a row, that's not good. Once in a while, or maybe one big update where everything has been fully implemented and thought out and tested for a month or 2, that's fine. But that's not what we've been getting. For example, Update 6 was another new, crazy idea, and was basically just a glorified tutorial. The story was cute and fun, but there were no new features that changed anything about how the rest of the game was played, just a few bug fixes. Now, I hear some of you screaming from the back. What about Update 7, 8, 9? I will concede that these updates improve upon pre-existing stuff, unlike Updates 3 to 6. However, Update 7 hasn't had as much of an impact on the way the game plays out as, say, Updates 1 or 2 did. That's saying something, considering that curved signals were added. They also added signal alerts, manual signal safety and visualization, and arrival sensors on auto blocks. I personally feel, in total, these features haven't had even a quarter of the impact that the content from Updates 1 and 2 added. That might be because everything was for endless here, unlike the earlier updates, which were balanced between game modes. Update 9. Yes, 9, since they started publicly discussing it before 8, is going to be about the main menu. Okay, but how does that improve the actual gameplay loop? It's a nice quality of life feature, but it feels like there's more important things that need improving right now. Update 8 is by far the best of these all, including new crossing types and more complex sensors. These features all seem good at a glance, but the crossing types are invalidated by tunnels and endless, and we already have effective crossings in timetable mode, though the vertical ones will be nice. Placing sensors on top of each other just makes certain endless maps even easier, but it doesn't really change actual junction design as much as it'll affect their compactness. And the complex sensors are neat, though the arrival sensor removes the challenge that comes with trains passing through stations, and the routing sensors having per train type routing is most useful when you have a ton of space, but the game's all about building in limited spaces, so it's not even as impactful as it could be. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate these changes, but when compared to previous updates, these all just feel lacking. And they didn't even mention arrival sensors and auto blocks for the Update 7 post, instead prioritizing level load times and achievements. And Update 9 was advertised long before Update 8, despite the menu being less impactful than the crossings and sensor improvements. Those decisions kinda confuse me. In the end, though, every update past Update 2 seems to be one designed to drive hype, sales, and improve the image of the game above all else. When you look at Update 3, what was it? A cool new idea which was under-tested and didn't leave enough of an impact for what it was, but got the community hyped up prior to its release. Update 4? Same thing. Hyped, under-tested, problematic. Update 5? Hyped, only slightly problematic, but still problematic. Update 6? They released a 100% free demo. How's that not supposed to drive sales to the game? People play, enjoy, want more, buy. Update 7? Signals on curves was a very popular suggestion on the suggestions website. It was dropped to most players out of nowhere as a surprise to get people interested in the game again. Update 9? All we know right now is the stuff about the menus, which is mostly just flashy visuals. The community involvement here won't actually have any impact on the gameplay, but will still get people hyped knowing the devs are, quote-unquote, listening to us. When I say under-tested, I really do mean under-tested. Remember how I mentioned Update 8? Well, those crossings, which seem to be a pretty important shift in how tracks are saved in the game, were added to the alpha and beta tests on the 8th of September. The update, meanwhile, is scheduled to release on the 13th, 5 days later. The sensors weren't much better, seemingly first introduced on the 4th, which is better, but it's still only 9 days to test. Are either of those windows of time really enough? And it's not just for Update 8. The scheduled release dates for these updates have been getting faster and faster, meaning there's less time to add impactful features and less time to fix them before release 2. As for future updates, well, I don't think I can talk about some of what I heard behind the scenes. There was a non-disclosure agreement in my contract. I don't know if it still counts now that I'm not active, but I'm not taking any chances. If I could mention what I heard, trust me, there would be another smoking gun. There is one idea they want to do for a future update that they have made public, and therefore I can discuss. That being shunting. You know, being able to disconnect and connect cars, locomotives. It's a cool idea on paper, even if I personally am skeptical that would fit in with the game well, but before Update 7 was even released, they did a stream talking about the future shunting update they planned sometime for this fall. Here's a direct quote from a server member who was there for that stream.
Come to think of it, remember how they had a stream recently about upcoming features, and how we were all told we could ask questions? The amount of "we don't know yet" we got regarding shunting was far more than I expected, honestly. Almost every question that got even slightly technical was responded to with something along the lines of, "maybe it will be," or "we were thinking it could be." I was pretty concerned about the lack of information about the new mechanics, despite the fact that they were talking about those same ideas as being the main focus of the next update. The worst part of it was the whole stream was supposed to be about shunting, not as a way to make suggestions per se, but as a way to ask questions. Despite that, most questions were effectively answered with a shrug. It was really weird.
When you're trying to promote an update as potentially impactful as shunting is it really a good idea to start talking about it when you don't have any concrete ideas for it and aren't really looking for suggestions? It was in such an early stage of development that it's, well, maybe not even in development for all we know, especially with them focusing on these other updates right now. Basically, fresh off the press with an idea, they started advertising it like it was almost ready to roll when they really didn't fully know what it was going to be like and didn't want to commit to anything. The stream was just to hype up the community. There was little to no other value it had. Still don't believe this is all about image? Well, how about some sponsored content? How about requesting Steam reviews from people to try and get to 95% upvotes? How about that thing earlier where I mentioned they routinely tried to bring strong negative comments from me to DMs, so public discussions about them wouldn't continue? The big nail in the coffin for me is actually something already on this channel. Remember the quote-unquote developer commentary I did? Why do you think it always had those quotation marks? I didn't add those because I was just a contractor. I added them because I was requested to separate any negative comments about the game from being associated with the dev team. Why do you think there was such a huge explanation about that in the first episode? They requested this because even something so mundane as a removed feature or fixed bug was something they didn't want to take responsibility for. Why not? It was stuff they'd fixed, and it was an interesting way to explore the history of this game. A great way to build hype for it by showing it has been improved. Why did they want to avoid any responsibility for the things they fixed? I do somewhat understand why the game has gone in this direction. As a company, you gotta be able to actually make money off of your product. And you can't say this strategy hasn't worked. Even though most months the amount of people playing is on a downward trend, the total number has slowly increased due to the spikes in popularity that draw in tons of people, where enough stick around to increase the number of active players. Well, would you really expect me to go this far just to suddenly switch gears midway through? Nah. They had so much momentum going into Steam Early Access, and now they're just trying to keep it going instead of realizing that initial hype is gone and letting go of that dream. They will always be looking for new players. It's what a game needs to survive. But if they ever plan on adding DLC, which Angel, one of the developers, talks about a lot, they need to fix and improve the base game so that current players will consider buying these expansions. The big problem this new approach is causing has to be how parts of the game are getting neglected in favor of pushing out more updates. Instead of fixing and polishing what's already there, they're pushing out major things to draw people in, instead of things that would actually keep people involved with the community. From the former community member known simply as Fish.
I left the community Discord server because it felt like it was falling apart and like my time there was done. I only really talked to like 3 server members in DMs anyways, so I didn't really feel the need to stay. I felt like I didn't have much of an impact, and the devs were focusing on things that people didn't really want or need, or things that weren't beneficial. I haven't really seen people get all that excited about any new features recently, well, at least before I left. I left the community Discord server because it felt like it was falling apart and like my time there was done. I only really talked to like 3 server members in DMs anyway, so I didn't really feel the need to stay. I felt like I didn't have much of an impact, and the devs were focusing on things that people didn't really want or need, or things that weren't beneficial. I haven't really seen people get all that excited about any new features recently, well, at least before I left.
If we look at updates 3, 4, and 5, they basically included no new features for any other mode, aside from things that primarily helped with rush hour or the inventory. Update 6 had literally nothing outside of the story mode and some bug fixes. Update 7 was less impactful than previous updates like it. Most of these updates created completely new things to do with the game, rather than cleaning up everything they've left unfinished. And, well, there's a lot of things that are unfinished. Remember how I was complaining about the color picker? That's an example. Well, how about signals on curves, where a developer publicly admitted that there was a better way to visualize them, but decided not to include it just because they liked the quote-unquote cleaner look they currently have? How about the hover over destination UI, where they showed off things with better visual separation but never implemented any of them? I do feel like they have too many features they want to add, so instead of fully implementing them, they do a half implementation and move on to the next feature. Like, remember the trial train button? I know that was originally just a simple misunderstanding, how it was supposed to autocorrect the train schedule for you, but it didn't actually do that, and then they just left it as is and never fixed it. Instead of going back and correctly implementing an insanely useful map-making feature, they just left it in its uncompleted mediocre state. Also in the editor, there's the issue of signal stopping penalties being turned on by default. People have said for a long time that they shouldn't be the default option, as it's typically infuriating to use the mechanic, and is better off as a feature to occasionally use to amplify maps in certain trains, rather than something to use as a baseline. Despite this, the toggle hasn't been set to off by default since its inclusion for some reason. Those are some complaints about the editor. How about the latest mode, which they spent 3 updates making, Rush Hour? Well, the in-game global median leaderboard sucks. For casual players, you have to aim to just be above average, and then you can't compare yourself to others. For competitive players, you can't compare yourself to others at all unless they're on your friends list already, as the median will always be lower than your score. There's a solution to this. Make the leaderboard pull data for the player who's just slightly better than you. In fact, this was the solution suggested back when the median solution was first implemented, as previously it would only show first place, which was too competitive, causing casual players to compete against unachievable times and get frustrated with the game mode. If instead the game uses the score from the person who's slightly better than you, no matter where you are on the leaderboards, there is always a goal to achieve that is within your scope to achieve. How about timetable? Well, there's no way to tell how you got penalized until the map is complete, or if you're paying insanely close attention. This makes it hard to actually keep track of when you lose points, so if you're the kind of player who likes aiming for perfection, you just have to play out the map entirely until you can know what was messed up. If you could somehow get that information earlier, like, say, hovering over the score at the top of the screen, you could easily just load a previous save and find exactly what went wrong immediately, rather than having to go through the entire level multiple times just to get one complete playthrough. This would help facilitate more ways of play. Endless, despite being the most popular mode, is one of the worst. I'll only focus on one of the biggest flaws for now, though, that being the score. You see, Endless is a mode all about optimization. You want your system to be the best it can be. The score is supposed to help guide that, giving you a way to gauge how well you're doing. Because the score is all about money, though, it pushes you towards accepting contracts that reward you the most cash. One type of contract in particular does this best: intercity contracts. These give an unreasonable amount of money, but are really hard to manage, requiring fast tracks, high average speeds, and direct routes. Because of these high demands, intercities always best run in systems where they're unopposed, where they can't be slowed down by other, slower services. And since they're just way better than commuters or urban transits, sometimes it's best to exclusively run intercity trains on their own specialized system. Oh, who do I kid? Sometimes? No. It's just strictly better to do things this way under the current scoring system. On a save where I exclusively ran intercity trains on a separated system, I was able to get 3.2 million points pretty easily without having too many commuter services. On another playthrough where I tried to mash intercities with other services, I was only able to get a score of 2.8 million. That may not seem like much, but shortly after I reached that score, everything fell apart because the system got too crammed and trains started to pile up and I started getting a ton of penalties. I dropped down to around 2.2 million, around 1 million less than the intercity exclusive map. Some may claim the reason this is bad is because it's so clearly broken in comparison to other strategies. This is true, Because it's the best method to boost your score, it's what most players will gravitate towards in the endgame, leading to a homogenized experience for players. However, it's also a very linear playstyle, as any deviations from it is just strictly worse. This not only leads to a singular endgame result which players gravitate towards because of the scoring system, but also a linear one that doesn't allow for the creativity that draws players to this game in the first place. After all, Endless is all about building your system, right? What's the point when it's just better to build the same as everyone else? This isn't the only problem with Endless, but it's definitely the worst of them. And sadly, one that I don't really fully know how to fix. I do have one idea, though. What if Red Research gave a small score multiplier? Like, say, it added a 0.1 multiplier for every Red Research in an hour, starting at a base of 1. That way, after around 20 coachyard contracts, 10 inbound, 10 outbound, you would have twice the score that you had before. The system isn't perfect. It definitely has the potential to still be abused, but at least it would introduce a second clearly abusable system. Neither one at a glance would be clearly better than the other. There would still be a quote-unquote perfect strategy. However, that strategy would be harder for new players to find going into the endgame, as it's muddied between the lines of two very powerful ways to play the game. This idea could definitely be improved, but it's far better than the system we have right now. The more this neglect continues, the more older community members, such as myself, will be driven away. The more that community is driven away, the less people there are to pass down knowledge about how to play well to newcomers. The less knowledge people have about the game, the more frustrated they get, and the tutorial really isn't enough for long-term play. The more frustrated these players are, the more likely they are to leave before they can pass down their knowledge, and the cycle repeats. While the number of active players has increased, the number of people actively a part of the community has done anything but that, and people are starting to notice.
To be honest, most of the server is kind of dead, or just a frequently asked question forum. It is sad to see how it's turned out.
At this point, I think there are a few major decisions that will decide the fate of the game. Will the developers respond to this video? Will they remain silent? If they do respond, do they make claims that I was problematic? Do they make an apology and say it'll be fixed, but change little to nothing? Or will they actually make an effort to change their methods? And for you, the community, what will you do with this information? Will you keep moving forward, just accepting everything as fact? Or will you try and force their hand? Will you accept any apology, hold it in skepticism, or ignore it and quit the game regardless? Would you leave for another game? This background footage is from a discontinued demo for a project simply titled Train Dispatcher. Creative, I know. The former developer contacted me after hearing about the drama with Railroute. They had a thing or two to say about the drama, and were far more concerned about it than actually discussing their own project. It's been discontinued for a few years now, after all. It only really came up because they mentioned it briefly when talking about their past experiences with Railroute and how weird the recent developments felt after how things were a few years ago. I took the opportunity to ask if I could get a copy, and they generously let me try it out, despite it being so old and there being many prominent bugs. It's, honestly, pretty good. More a proof of concept than an actual game, but even in its current state, there are some features better than what Railroute has to offer. Goes to show that maybe with the right people working on the game, it can truly reach its full potential really quickly. And with the experience I've gotten from helping Railroute, I feel there's a lot of potential here. With a blank slate, nothing would really need to be reworked. Everything could be built from scratch. Well, I say that, but there are a few catches. First, this demo was discontinued because the developer lost interest in the project. There's no guarantee they'd even want to return to it. If a project like this were to take off, it might need to truly be built from the ground up with another developer backing it. Second, actually, it would need to be reworked from the ground up, no matter what. This demo is horribly unoptimized and has a ton of bugs, and was coded with non-gaming coding skills. Even if it was just remaking the core gameplay with new twists, it could be a big project for anyone to take on. 3, it would only really happen if enough of the community showed interest. It definitely is a big project to take on. The former developer said he wasn't currently interested in continuing, but he might return to try if enough of the current Railroad community showed interest in the project, and also if some more people helped develop the program since he doesn't have much free time to do it himself. This is a long shot for sure, but if the Beverage team doesn't do anything to fix the current strategy and game, maybe it's time we, as a community, make our own place to stay. In the end, I just want things to be better. I don't care if it's Railroad or something else that fixes these problems. They just need to be fixed. This is a call for action. It's up to you now. And with that, I'm done. I know I have more grievances with how the game's turning out, but I've rambled long enough and hopefully proved my point. No more Railroad on this channel. Sorry. Hopefully I made someone happy finishing the commentary series, but I don't have the heart to keep playing a game which has so many flaws, and I doubt I'd ever return even if they were fixed. Thanks for joining me on this crazy journey. Hopefully I'll see you in the future. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. Whatever you choose, take care, folks. Farewell.